Bartimaeus Institute. Thank you for joining us. This is the text we are dealing with. We're halfway through this text. So we looked at the first negative object lesson and found that that was a little bit challenging and depressing because the rich farmer's solipsism is so much like the way we think about security. And now Jesus is going to assure us that there actually is another way to think about this. Now, friends on the webinar and here at Ojai Valley Church, this really is the heart of the matter. In the boom days of the globalizing economy, international economists who were lauding the miracle of the kind of neoliberal economic relations around the world used to boast the phrase or the acronym TINA. There is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. This is the only game in town now that socialism has clearly proven itself to be a failure. And therefore, don't even imagine or suggest that there is an alternative to the way things are. I believe, dear sisters and brothers, that we have internalized that severe absolutism, and we don't, in our heart of hearts, we're not terribly confident that there is some other way than the market way. Jesus begs to differ, and he's about to introduce us to this other way. But before we listen to Jesus, I want to tell a story from my life. My great mentor in life was a man by the name of LaDon Sheets, and LaDon knew a whole lot about the way of the market because he was an IBM executive in the heyday of the early computing, the first computer boom in the 1960s, and he was a high roller and went all over the world helping the computer revolution succeed. And then he met Clarence Jordan, Southern Baptist preacher of Koinonia Farms fame. And Clarence stopped LaDon dead in his tracks and began to welcome and invite him into the kingdom of God and its alternative economics. And LaDon was a thirsty soul. He was kind of like the lonely rich man, and he wanted relationship and he wanted meaning, and so he ended up after a real wrestling match giving away all his considerable wealth and going down to live with sharecroppers in rural Georgia. A few years later, Clarence passed away, and LaDon sort of assumed the mantle of one of the leaders at Koinonia. And I met LaDon in 1976, and he stopped me in my tracks by sharing with me out of the Sermon on the Mount. Thereafter, LaDon was my most trusted confidant, my mentor, calling me onto the radical way of discipleship of Jesus. LaDon ended up leaving Koinonia and living the rest of his life out of a backpack. And he would travel from one city to another, one community to another, often staying at local Catholic worker houses, where he would serve the poor and do hospice with the dying from the streets, in between long stretches of doing jail time for civil disobedience in opposition to the arms race. In 2002, well, when we were inaugurating the very first of many Word and World schools in Greensboro, North Carolina, Elaine and I got a phone call from Texas, where LaDon had been caretaking his father, and got the terrible news that LaDon had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was given just 6 weeks to live at age 68. And my dad died at 68 too. Well, we immediately left and found our way to Texas and began the most amazing journey of community hospice with this man that not only Elaine and I loved, but that people all around the country loved, because he had been this itinerant apostle of the great economy. When LaDon was diagnosed, he not only didn't have health insurance, he didn't have a bank account. He just had what he had in his backpack. And in most people's opinion, he was crazy. And now the chickens were coming home to roost. He'd done this radical discipleship thing. He'd dispensed with his 401ks long ago, and he had nothing. Except for the fact that for 30 years, he had crisscrossed the country, staying with people and serving people and being attentive to people, because he wasn't distracted trying to make a buck. People attest, those who knew LaDon, attest that when they were with LaDon, they felt like they were the only person in the room. He was so attentive to young people and like little folk and teenagers and those of us in our 20s and 30s and old folks and dying folks. He was right there. In fact, we did discover he had a bank account after he passed away, and I think there's $75 in the bank account in Los Angeles, because he spent a lot of time at the LA Catholic Worker, and so we finally tracked this down by going through his papers. And Elaine and I went down to talk to some people at, I can't remember what bank it was, in downtown LA. And we started into this long explanation, because we figure this guy's got $75 in the bank. He's probably come in here once. You know, we have the death certificate. We're trying to close, down all the loose ends. We go up, we launch into the story about who this man was. The teller goes, "Oh, I remember LaDon. Yeah, he came in here, I think, once or twice. We had the most amazing conversation." We transported LaDon to Central California, to the Guadalupe Catholic Worker there, and began a 4-month process of community hospice, in which people from all over the country came to care for the person that they loved. For 4.5 months, more than 100 people came for a couple of days or a couple of weeks to cook, to clean. Nurses came to care. Brother came from Kansas to build a coffin because he was a carpenter. All simply because this man had demonstrated the kingdom to them, and they wanted to repay the gift. LaDon's name in French means the gift. So this thing that Jesus is talking about here, to paraphrase Mark Twain, who famously, when asked if he believed in infant baptism, quipped, "Believe it? Hell, I've seen it." I want to testify to you that I have seen this other economy work, and this abundance to come out of seeming nothing from a capitalist point of view. And there is no text in all of Scripture that says it more eloquently than the text we're about to look at. But it's also important to preface this text by acknowledging that this text not only deals with economics, it also deals with the ecological crisis we're in. You see, our confidence in a market economy has driven us to the brink of ecological disaster. And so it turns out we're not such geniuses after all. And in fact, we might be the fools in trusting in our bigger barns, in our accumulation-oriented economy. So we're in this environmental struggle to survive, and the lament of the prophet Jeremiah, "Take up weeping and wailing for the mountains, lamentations for the wilderness, because they're laid waste and no one passes through. Both the birds of the air and the animals have fled and are gone." This is the original Silent Spring. of Jeremiah. Well, we've just looked at the story of the rich farmer and his bigger barns. And in the teeth of this, Jesus is going to counsel us, don't be anxious. Listen to the birds, talk to the flowers. And just as I believe there is no text more important to the alternative cosmology, so there is no text more highly trivialized in our churches than this one. In fact, to our modern North American ears, it's simplistic, it's extreme, and above all, it's naive. And in the wake of the recent global meltdown of financial markets, Jesus' counsel not to be anxious seems to be frankly absurd. And I hope we feel the weight of it, because outside the little bubble of this room, it's how everybody thinks about this text. Jesus' counsel to not worry, if we Christians pay any attention to this, we sentimentalize it, right? This is Jesus' little St. Francis moment. Oh, look, Jesus, he's like a little bird fountain there. You got a little squirrel on his shoulder. That's so cute. Yeah, Jesus, he's talking to the birds, he's talking to the flowers, he's sure as hell not talking to me. Because this is nonsense. This teaching cuts diametrically across our most sacred assumptions about our entitlement to re-engineer nature and secure economic security through market dominance. But here's just a little thought. What if he's dead serious? What if he means exactly what he says? Because if he does, friends, we're in a whole world of trouble. To take him seriously here means that we must confront exactly the three primary pathologies that characterize life in neoliberal capitalism, the beginning of the 21st century: anxiety, alienation, and addiction. Those are the three things that characterize all of our lives, both personally, communally, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, and politically. So I want to commend this text in Luke 12 as a text of terror. But if heeded, it might just hold the key to our liberation. So, red pill or blue pill? First part of this meditation was all about greed and is a call to economic justice. The second part now turns to the deeper underpinning of such a call, what I think we should call the cosmology of grace. Jesus says to the disciples, for this reason, this is an emphatic phrase in Greek, meaning because of the story of this miserable, solipsistic, affluenza-ridden farmer, because of all of that, I'm telling you, don't be anxious. Now, here's a heads up. It's not a suggestion. It's in the imperative mood. It's a command. Do not be anxious. Yeah, whatever. But it appears like a refrain through this entire discourse. Don't be anxious, don't be anxious, don't be anxious. It's a command. You see it in verse 22, 25, again in 26. Now, look at the contrasts to build a bridge between these two texts that we've been looking at this afternoon. And those of you in webinar land will have to review the story of the rich farmer. The contrast between Jesus' counsel and the rich farmer's self-referential strategy is striking. The farmer says, I will say to my soul, or self, suke is the same soul, self, take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. Jesus, don't be anxious for your psuche, for your life, about what you will eat or for your body. Do you see the way that Luke is specifically contrasting these two worldviews? And now he launches into his, I don't know what to call it. It's some kind of weird Zen moment. Now, what do some of your translations say in verse 23? What are we supposed to do? Consider the ravens? Any other translations have anything different? Think of, yes. Meditate upon. Look at the ravens. That's actually a little closer. The verb, what you see there in Greek, also in the imperative mood, is it commands action here and now. And what it really means is completely turn your attention to. For a moment, be Ladon Sheets and completely focus your attention away from all this other nonsense on this. So it's not a suggestion, hey, every once in a while, all you really busy people, take time to smell the flowers. Right? That would be the sort of sentimentalizing approach, which is how we tend to read it. But that's not what it says in Greek. It's a severe command. Stop what you're doing and pay attention. Here you see it's rhetorically very elegant. There are two object lessons, right? Just as there were two negative object lessons in the first half of this text, namely the person seeking inheritance and the parable of the rich farmer, so now we have two positive object lessons, ravens and lilies, and you see the rhetorical repetition. They neither sow nor reap or toil or spin, and yet God takes care of them. And God actually is paying attention to you even more than this. Therefore, don't be anxious. So if anything's worth saying once, it's worth saying 3 or 4 times, repetition being the key to pedagogy. Once again, I just want us to stop here and try to see if we can feel the resistances inside us. Is anybody feeling any resistance here? If we really want to be brutally honest, here's where we sort of go into entertainment mode. Oh, Jesus is a bird watcher. Jesus got his little wildflower handbook. He's up with Charlita up in the oak grove. That's neat. Now, can we get back to religion? It's all very sweet. Ain't got nothing to do with economics. But here's the thing, friends. If we dismiss Jesus here, we will lose the key that could open the door to another world. Now, Jesus is probably not unlike the folks who took the walk at lunch, likely on a walk himself, just kind of pointing this stuff out. He was like that. He was a pedagogue, right? That comes from people who teach as they walk along. That was the ancient way of learning. And he's saying to us, I know y'all are anxious. I know you're sweating this thing, and I know you're worried about your school debt and your medical insurance and your mortgage payments, and I understand that you don't see any alternative. So turn your attention just for a quick minute to this. And he points down or up. Turns out the alternative cosmology is right here. We just don't have eyes to see it. We just can't see. It's this close. It's right in front of us. It's the sensuous, embodied, alive, mystical world of the biosphere. And we are breathing it in and out all the time. And we're walking on it, and we're passing by it, and we're not seeing it. And we're not seeing it because we're completely preoccupied with our built environments and the works of our hands and the calculations of our anxious spirit. And because, as for nature, we've so objectified it and commodified it and disappeared it under asphalt that actually sometimes it is a little hard to access this. It's harder for us now to see it. Well, I know. First example is the raven. So pay attention to the ravens. They're not sowing or reaping. In other words, they're not doing any agricultural hard labor like all the peasant class, nor, like the rich, do they have storehouses or barns. And yet, they are fed, meaning there's an economy working here, and it works for the ravens. How about that? And actually, it works for every single other creature other than the bipeds. How about that? That's a massive economy at work, and we don't see it. Now, there's a little bit of midrash going on here, as we might imagine. Or, no, we're good Christians, so we don't really care. But nevertheless, there's some good Hebrew Bible stuff going on here. Job, who provides for the ravens its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food, right? This is specifically appealing to the book of Job, Job 38, one of the great creation texts in our Bible. God is paying attention to the need of ravens for food. They cry out, God answers. Boy, talk about an amazing natural cosmology of abundance. Or Psalm 147:9. God gives to the animals their food and the young ravens when they cry. This is why Jesus, of all the birds he could choose, chooses the ravens, because he wants us to be biblically literate and understand that he's not making this stuff up. This is not new, it's old wisdom. And how about even cooler, how about Elijah, who was during a time of famine when the built economy broke down, went into the wilderness and was fed by a raven who was fed by God. Yeah, well, that's a dove, raven, depending, yeah. But yeah, that, and yet that bird finally landed. Yeah. I want you to feel this. The prophet is fed by the bird who is fed by God. Birds don't know anything about storage facilities, but God takes care of them. I believe that Jesus here is making this simple, profound statement about the ultimate reality of the great economy of creation. All undomesticated creatures live directly reliant on the great giver. Notice that this is a deep ecological kind of riff, but it's very relational. This is a very personal universe. There is this dependence on nature, but it is a nature that is presided over by a benevolent creator, not on human economic structures. Now this, I would suggest, rather radically relativizes our industrial economy, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Jesus goes on now in the second part of the refrain to say, and can any of you by worrying add a single hour to your span of life? And some of your translations may say something different, because people tend to paraphrase here. Anybody say anything different? A single hour to our span of life is actually a paraphrase. Literally, it's adding a cubit to our stature. It's, and us shorter people, you know, we always kind of imagine what I might look like if I was tall, dark, and handsome. And Jesus says, wow, you can't add anything to your height. The Greek word here is prosthenai, right? Don't be preoccupied with prosthesis, y'all. Have you ever thought about how we are preoccupied with prosthesis as a culture? We want a little plastic surgery, a little prosthesis. We can fix anything. We can extend our lives. It's the ancient lust after the fountain of youth. Jesus says, dudes, yes. All right, thank you. Don't worry about it. Here again, Jesus is alluding to Psalm 39. Lord, let me know my end and the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. Now, listen to this. You have made my days a few handbreadths, right? That's the ancient way of measuring. My lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil as they heap up and do not know who will gather. Who's he talking about? Heaping up. Talking about people who think they can extend their life by accumulating. Exactly what Jesus was talking about concerning the rich man and his barns. Example number 2. Oh, the flowers. Now, this is actually pretty cool if you've ever been to Palestine. These flowers, wildflowers, still bloom all over the landscape. They're beautiful. Krinon, wild lilies, bloom all over the Jordan Valley in the springtime. Significantly, these lilies adorned Solomon's temple because they're just widely recognized as beautiful. But here, interestingly, the lilies are contrasted with Solomon. But I tell you, the lilies neither spin nor toil, but I'm telling you, Solomon in all his glory was never wrapped around like one of these. Now this euphemism probably immediately is referring to the sumptuous royal garb that would have been worn by an ancient Oriental king, with lots of furs and imported purple and so on. But it's probably really a euphemism not just for Solomon's garb, but what was Solomon really wrapped around in? Concubines. Yeah, there's that. Good, yeah. We will choose not to go down that road. Where did Solomon live? Yeah, Solomon was the one responsible for the building of the first great temple. And to do that, he became, just like all the other imperial kings around him, by drafting forced labor to cut stone in the mountains and go up to the cedars and cut hardwood and bring them, float them down the coast and bring them up to Jerusalem, all by forced labor. We're told all about this in 1 Kings 5 and 6, making sweet deals with the Phoenician kings to get luxury items. So Solomon built this huge temple, and then he built himself a house called the House of the Cedars of Lebanon, which was floor to ceiling with hardwood Lebanon, hardwood from Lebanon. How do you think people felt about the temple in Jesus' time? This, of course, was the second temple, because the first one had been destroyed and then was rebuilt, most famously by Herod the Great. Magnificent building. Talk about your tower of intimidation. Loomed over the horizons. The second temple was considered to be one of the great wonders of the ancient world. What did Solomon's temple represent from, let's say, a civilizational perspective to your average Israelite? Success. I mean, it's the apex of Israelite civilization. From the dominant culture point of view, it's the most powerful the Israelite monarchy ever was. It was all downhill after that. It was the biggest building, the most power, the most concentration of wealth. It is the height of Israel's civilizational aspirations, this Solomonic temple. And Jesus is telling us that this one wildflower, oops, watch or you'll step on it, has more intrinsic value than the height of Israelite civilization. Holy shit, what if he means it? No, really. What if he means it? Like, what if in the eyes of the divine, actually it's true? That one wildflower is more intrinsically valuable than the ultimate work of our hands? Well.
One other detail in both the rich pool and the ravens is the reference to the storehouses of grain, which, remember, that's what the slaves were doing in Egypt. They were building Pharaoh's storehouses of grain.
Yeah. Yeah. So Will's talking about storehouses of grain is what Israelite slaves were building in Egypt, and so they should have been, that's probably where their natural suspicion of storehousing, yeah, go ahead.
So he sneaks in this little reference to their history when they were the victims of empire, and then in the occasion of the lilies, he sneaks in with probably, some people might have missed, but a pretty clear reference to when Israel was trying to be its own empire. Say both projects of empire, when we were victims and we were sycophants of it, we're not what we're called to be.
So Will is suggesting that this is kind of an anti-imperial rant as well. Don't build storehouses like you did in Egypt, and don't be like your own King Solomon. Pay attention instead to the great economy that's right in front of you. I don't know, friends. It's the absolute opposite of the capitalist cosmology that we all have internalized, which routinely sacrifices wildflowers to imperial architecture. Routinely, friends. Our way of life routinely authorizes a continuing holocaust of extinction and endangerment. The Baji dolphin, gone. West African black rhino, gone. Golden toad, Pyrenean ibex, sphinx macaw, all gone. And this is old data. That's what we think about the wildflowers. What if we are not just misguided, but utterly, utterly wrong? We are destroying that which is of intrinsic value in order to build more and more of that which only makes us anxious. Consider the spotted owl, says Jesus. Blather, say our economists. But it's not blather. You see, Jesus, as Will pointed out, is invoking the cosmology of Exodus 16 that we talked about briefly this morning, which is also the cosmology of indigenous and traditional peoples the world over and throughout history. It's a way of seeing translated into economic lifeways characterized by symbiosis with nature, sustainable and local production and consumption, cooperative and equitable work patterns, has been shown by such anthropologists as Marshall Solins and Paul Shepard. The Bible is talking about nothing more or less than recentering us in the oldest wisdom on the planet. Remember what we were talking about this morning. For 99% of human history, human beings lived according to this cosmology. And now, in about 3,000 years, in the 1% of human existence, we've managed to almost completely disappear the gift economy in favor of the rich man's economy, and now it's an end game. Our generation gets to see that it's an end game. Now, this cosmology was indigenous not only to traditional people, but you see it in the Hebrew Bible. You even see it in the primitive church, the early church fathers. I love this quote from Basil the Great. May you, whenever you see cultivated plants or wild ones, water plants or land plants, flowering or flowerless, recognize grandeur in the tiniest thing. Continue always in your admiration and increase, I pray, your love for the Creator. Early church fathers and mothers, particularly the ones out in the desert, they got this. I don't know, friends, if Jesus is right, I mean, if he's not just whistling Dixie, if we're supposed to take this seriously, our entire economic cosmology falls down like a house of cards. Because the history of progress, of which all of us in this room are a product, was founded on the idea that nature is an object to exploit for industrial purposes. And value is only what we impute through our relentless attempts to re-engineer the biosphere for profit. But here's the thing, sisters and brothers, our historical project has placed both our ecological and economic systems on the brink of collapse. So who is the fool? This text puts us at this archetypal crossroads. God is calling the rich man a fool, talking about our way of life. Jesus, on the other hand, is saying, so pay attention instead to this. Our financial advisors are saying, don't be a fool. It's a conundrum. But are we going to trust an economic cosmology that sustained human life for 100,000 years or more, or one that may not last another 100? That's the interesting thing about a text like this. You know, 19th century Protestantism writing shotgun with the Capitalist Express couldn't have been less interested in a text like this. But suddenly here we are, and it's all going to hell. And suddenly a text like this is a little bit more interesting, at least if we see ourselves in crisis. Jesus' exhortation not to seek food and drink is a specific repudiation of the rich man's decadent feasting in the shadow of the barns of greed, in favor of the great economy. I don't think Jesus is on drugs. I don't think Jesus is messing with our heads. I think he's dead serious. This ancient wisdom is encoding the reality that modern ecological science is just now rediscovering, namely that whether we know it or not, we are utterly dependent upon the solar dividend, the hydrologic cycle, the microscopic exudates in our soil, the photosynthetic exchange, and on and on and on, which is all part of the great economy. We didn't make it. We can't re-engineer it. We can only ruin it. And if we still think that we run this show, that if we do not return to a fundamental acknowledgement of the primacy of the great economy, we will destroy the very fabric of life that sustains us. And on that continuum, we got plenty to be anxious about. Jesus clarifies, this is the third allusion to empire. All the nations of the world hustle after such things, literally. It's an intensification of, it's not just seek, but it's strive, it's hustle, it's by any means necessary, right? All the nations of the world. He's talking about Roman imperial culture, which was awash in anxiety just as ours is, had all kinds of alienation and addiction just like ours. Folks were taught to compete incessantly to accrue private wealth in order to satisfy engineered appetites. The divine caretaker, on the other hand, just wants to gift us with enough. Now, this is a really important point here, because I know you're having a conversation with your dad or your financial advisor or the church board of deacons in your head here, thinking, wow, this is really not going to play in Peoria. It's really important that Jesus doesn't dismiss material life here. He's not calling us to be ascetics, to transcend our material needs. He emphasizes that God, as a nurturing heavenly parent, is mindful of legitimate material needs. That's good news. The vision here is an economy of enough. Indeed, says Jesus, seek the kingdom first, and everything will be added. Prosthenai, same verb. Everything will be added. Meaning, not as our industrial engineering prosthetics, but as a gift that a parent would give to a child. We can't add anything, but God will add it all to us. The rich man secured his food and drink by playing the market to his advantage. You know, the reason he was storing that stuff up wasn't just for his own benefit. You know, you take stuff off the market, jacks up the price, you become even richer. But he could never be sure he had enough. Disciples, in contrast, are to resist anxiety by trusting in the divine provision of enough for everyone. It is God's good pleasure. And here I've left the male language in there because I don't want to miss the parental concern here. It is your Father's good pleasure to give this to you, this alternative economy, as a gift. I want to end by talking a little bit about contemporary philosophers who are seeing this old wisdom again. Obviously, one of them is Wendell Berry. How many of you are Wendell Berry fans here? A lot of people reading Wendell Berry. If you're not, you should. Probably the most important theologian in America, and he's a farmer. And he's for years talked about the two economies, what he calls the great economy and the little economy. Great economy, of course, is creation. It is a circulating economy. People labor in it, and creatures work in it, and they're fed, and there's an exchange. There's interdependence. But the problem, says Wendell Berry, is that the little economy, namely the industrial order, with its penchant for control and lack of limits, doesn't see itself as a little economy. It sees itself as the only economy, and thus makes itself exclusive by the simple expedient of valuing only what we can use. So raw material is there to be transformed mechanically into something else. So Wendell Berry says the industrial economy is based on the invasion and pillage of the great economy. Here's a typical Wendell Berry quote. By using up such goods as topsoil, fossil fuel, and fossil water, we incur a debt to the future that we cannot repay. Interesting now that the language of indebtedness comes back in. What we call use, the future will call theft. If our economic ideal is maximum profit with minimum responsibility, I love this line, why should we be surprised to find our corporations so frequently in court? Right? Maximum profit, minimum responsibility. Everybody's trying to get away with it. This approach, interestingly, has, over the last 25 years, been again becoming part of the conversation. There is now a field called ecological economics, and I want to introduce you to another really important thinker whose name is Hazel Henderson, was one of the pioneering ecological economists and also a pioneering feminist economist. And this is a really simple model. You've got both of these diagrams in your packet. And you know, you gotta love feminist economics because they're trying to keep it simple, make it plain. So let's bake a cake. Try to make this complicated thing relatively simple. She said, look, the total productive system of an industrial society is like a cake, she says. But the problem is not all the cake is valued. So an enormous amount of bureaucratic and political energy it goes into the calculation of the gross domestic product. But the only thing that counts for back in the early 90s when she did this, it was called the GNP, now it's usually called the GDP. Only the sum total of the private sector and the public sector, meaning, transportation systems and government job sector and so on, and maybe a little bit of the underground economy, meaning like farm workers here in the Oxnard Valley, who oftentimes are paid under the table. That all counts when our government bureaucrats calculate the GDP. How important is our GDP calculations, by the way? I know none of us spend any time thinking about it, but actually whole nations rise and fall and live and die, not to mention corporations and the massive movements of capital or goods, depending on how a gross domestic product is calculated. It's the preeminent sign of viability today, not politics. But she points out, here's the weird thing. There's all this stuff that's part of the economy that isn't being counted. And she names two. And once again, being a feminist economist, she calls it the love economy and Mother Nature. It's beautiful. What is the love economy? Community, parenting, sharing, church. It's coming slowly, sclerotically. The love economy. I know it's out there, but I don't usually see it. Actually, it surrounds us every single day. It's one of the main operating principles of this institute. Every time someone lends a hand, every time you stop somebody on the street and ask directions, that is the love economy. It's non-monetized, non-waged, and it don't count in our economic GDP. All sorts of human labor goes into the love economy. Every time Tom Hong says, Pastor, let me come help repair the porch. I'll bring my hammer on Saturday. That's the love economy working. He doesn't get paid. It doesn't count. It's not considered good for the economy, Tom, so take Saturday off, man. Every time we have a potluck, can you imagine actually life functioning without the love economy? Do you think this is genderized at all? How does the love economy tend to have a gender bias? How does that work? Yeah, Gabriel. Right, so males get paid more and hired first and fired last, and women are less important, and women's labor is less valued, and women are expected to do not only wage labor now, but also all the love economy labor, like cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids and, the soccer mom syndrome.
We're also charged more for health insurance.
Yeah, and then you get charged more for your self-insurance. Yeah. So none of this counts. But Hazel Henderson says, you can't run an economy without this. Just try to go out to work and ain't nobody packed you a lunch. It just can't work, and yet the fact that this is devalued means that it's invisible, means that women's work and love economy work and Tom Hong and his hammer are devalued, and that becomes a disincentive in a hyper-capitalist economy for folk to do that kind of stuff. So the love economy is shrinking in its sphere because more and more people want to get waged. What do I mean by that? Used to be that all elder care, all child care most education and most nursing all happened through the love economy. Now we're farming that out to private and public sectors. And not only are we not counting the love economy, we're not counting the earth. And that's where, New York City recently, some pencil neck tried to calculate the cost of rehabilitating the main upstate aquifer that supplies New York City with water because it had become so degraded. And they said, okay, if we bring in our engineering experts, what would be the price tag of either artificially creating an aquifer or cleaning up the aquifer that we have? And it ran into the trillions and trillions of dollars. We completely depend on nature to do all this economic work for us, and we just keep using it and abusing it as if it's completely worthless. The ozone, the water, the forests, the prairies. So ecological economists are trying to say, turn your attention back toward the great economy. So I love, this is, if you're interested in pursuing some of Hazel Henderson's work, she's got a whole bunch of stuff that she's done. On the basis of this kind of work, that's why Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson got together and said, isn't really the New Testament notion of the kingdom of God best understood as a great economy? We seek the kingdom of God in part by our economic behavior, and we fail to find it if that behavior is wrong. The human economy, if it is to be a good economy, must fit harmoniously within and correspond to the great economy. We are suddenly finding ourselves in the second decade of the 21st century faced with our need to pay attention to Jesus' command to pay attention. And if we do that, we won't be afraid to do things like redistribute our wealth. Because to redistribute your wealth is actually good for the ecology. Right? More diversity, more redistributive circulation there is, the healthier the ecology will be. That's what ecology is trying to teach economy. Nowhere in nature does stuff accumulate for its own benefit. If you try to store up water, it'll go bad. Flowing water is the healthiest water. Seeds want to distribute. If they're all piled on each other, the forest can't flourish. It's time to learn our economics from our ecology, and that's exactly what Jesus is inviting us to do. I gotta check where we are on time here. Yeah, we're good. So, this is the end of this rant. We're almost there. We all deserve medals for having to slowly and painfully work our way through this text. Make purses for you that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven. There's that folk wisdom again, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. I don't know about you, but I think Jesus, did get this stuff growing up. And if you don't think so, you should listen to his brother, who apparently grew up with the same mama. The very same thing we find in the book of James. Riches can only rot. Moths come and eat them. And gold and silver rust. Actually, they don't. But metaphorically speaking, your gold and silver will rot on you, and it will eat your flesh like fire, says James 5, because you have laid up treasure as your security strategy. And the way you have done that is by withholding the wages for those who cut grain in your fields. And held back by fraud, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord. That's James 5. So you imagine Jesus and James growing up in this kind of environment. Anyway, notice how here Jesus invites us to sell our possessions. Remember, it's us. We are the rich. Sell our possessions, give alms, and provide for ourselves a treasure in heaven that does not fail. All he's saying, nothing less and nothing more, is begin transitioning from the death economy to the great economy. And begin now. Later, this is going to be a very specific encounter with another rich man's story, and of course, the same language is used, and famously that rich man goes away very sad because he's not interested in doing it. And so it is, says Jesus at the end of the first section, for those who store up treasure for themselves are not rich toward God. That's how the first half of this text ended. And again, for here, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is a reiteration of the theme of the first part, economic justice for all. The cosmology of the non-anxious, interdependent web of life is by definition relational. This means that the purpose of an economy is to serve social relations, beginning with the poor, not vice versa. I want to say that again. The purpose of an economy is to promote social relations, especially with the poor. The economy we live in is an economy that cannibalizes social relations, particularly at the expense of the poor, which is why the measure of the integrity of an economy is always how the poor are treated. So we're going to talk a little bit this afternoon about, what all this means, Sabbath economics, how that lands in our lives. Sabbath economics, in a nutshell, is the struggle to resist these two cultures, which later in Luke are called the culture of mammon versus the culture of manna of Exodus 16. And just a final sort of benediction of a reminder. It's an end game that we're in. This is one way of saying it. This is humanity's ecological footprint, and round about 1986, human beings on the planet began using more bioproductive capacity than the planet could produce. And so we can't continue, and it's not going to work to pull everybody up to a middle-class status. So it's a very intense question that we in our generation are facing, and frankly, you, Tommy Shireman, and your generation, it is the central issue of how do we make a sustainable world. How serious, says Jim Spate, is the threat? This, by the way, is one of the best primers on this depressing subject, with the notably apocalyptic title, The Bridge at the End of the World. Here's one measure of the problem. All we have to do is destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world to our children and grandchildren is to keep doing exactly what we are doing today. Just keep doing it. We don't even have to grow anymore. Just continue to release greenhouse gases at current rates, impoverish ecosystems, release toxic chemicals at current rates, and the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. Friends, we all know that this is the truth, and yet we live daily in denial of it. And so what a great time to try to turn the attention of the church to the foolishness of the great economy. This is a sacred trust. And of course, it's not just that global people are exhausting global resources. It's we, the rich, who are drawing down on these resources. Our ecological footprints are profoundly disparate. We have the largest global footprint, or as Al Gore likes to put it in this map of per capita responsibility for CO2 in the atmosphere, the red nations are spewing far more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we are robbing the ozone layer. It's us. This is why people like Derek Jensen try to get us to see that this is an end game. Things have to change. Perhaps a kinder and gentler way of putting it is the transition movement. And I like the language of the transition movement. I agree with the analysis of Derek Jensen, but I think the strategy of the transition movement is that if we're going to turn this thing around, we're going to have to slowly and deliberately in every phase of our life begin to rethink and practice new habits and start thinking very differently about everything economically and ecologically. The time is now. This is the task of all of us in our generation. Hence, it has to be the mission of the church. It has to be the center of the mission of the church. And I would love to see us be working on a transition theology. The central logical theme for the church in the next 50 years should be transition, transition, transition. How do we change? And the beginning of change is to turn our attention away from the anxiety-ridden financial counselors of the system and toward the lessons of the great economy. Because, friends, we have just begun to get a view of what the future holds. This is a tar sands extraction in northern Alberta, where for hundreds of thousands of acres, the pristine boreal forest has been chewed up in a desperate attempt to extract oil for our oil-based economy. And it's madness. It's madness, however, that is part of a culture war in the church. This is the Cornwall Alliance. Anybody heard of the Cornwall Alliance? It's an evangelical environmental alliance based out of Cornwall, England, that is pro-development and that is primarily making a case that we do not have a climate change crisis. This is from their manifesto that's online. No convincing scientific evidence that human contribution to greenhouse gases is causing dangerous global warming. Alternatives won't work. And this is the church speaking, or part of the church. Fortunately for us, this is the other part of the church speaking. And just this last Sunday, 35,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest the Keystone XL pipeline, which is the last big of the tar sands project. It's going to run 1,000 miles from northern Alberta down to Texas. 35,000 people, many of them church folk, mobilized in Washington, D.C. It's the largest demonstration around climate change in history. Which side are our churches and our personal household discipleship going to be on? We're going to talk about after the break. I just want to say that I just want to put in a final word by way of a benediction. This is a hard text, and yet it's also a hopeful text. It offers us and demands a transition. And when I look around the room, this is a really nice intergenerational community. We got folks in their months. Harold. We have folks in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Did you know that? We got every decade represented here. I just want to say, and a shout out to those of you who are from generation under 35. There's a reason why so many of you are trying to figure out how to reconnect with the earth, how to learn how to work with alternative. Brother man Eric Hodge back there is the biodiesel czar of the Ojai Valley. He's making biodiesel in his garage, and he's running his shop on solar and biodiesel. Christine, what do you guys do with the waste product from that biodiesel? Oh my God, they make soap out of the glycerin from the biodiesel. These people, what are they thinking? It's just so awesome what we could do if we turn our attention to these matters. After the break, we're going to turn our attention to these matters. It could not be more urgent, not just for those of you under 35, but for every single one of us. And the good news is that Jesus doesn't just suggest it, he demands us to change our lenses and to transition. It's a great time to be church in the midst of this crisis. Yes, Tim. Yes.
Linnea, protest
Awesome.
referred to. It was amazing. Faith group. Amen.
Yeah, such a hopeful sign. Bill McKibben, good Methodist layman, and the work of 350.org, and so many other people collaborating. These are all signs of hope, just like Occupy is a sign of hope. And yet, all these things are being talked about 2,000 years ago. Because these are not new insights, friends. These are ancient insights. We're not trying to get forward to some utopian vision. We're trying to get back to a way of life that is in danger of being paved over. And the gospel is part of the resistance. That's really exciting. Now all we got to do is, as we learn what these texts say, we got to figure out how to read them. And then we got to figure out what we're going to do with them in our Lucan discipleship. Thanks for your attention. Many thanks to our webinar participants from 5 countries. We're not going to do